For 144 years, it stood over Barcelona like a question nobody could answer. A church so impossibly complex that the man who designed it openly admitted he would die long before it was finished. Cranes became part of the skyline. Scaffolding became permanent. Whole generations were born, grew old, and passed away while the same building crept upward stone by stone, refusing to be completed. So before we go any further, sit with this for a second. What kind of building takes longer to finish than most empires take to rise and fall? And here is the stranger question, the one that almost nobody asks: why would millions of people happily pay year after year to fund a church that not one of them would ever live to see completed? Stay with me, because this is a story of genius, fire, death, and a finish line that arrived exactly 100 years after the dreamer died. And the kind of person who stays till the very end is exactly who this channel was built for. The stone that started everything. The story does not begin with a genius. It begins with a bookseller and a crime. Named Josep Maria Boccabella traveled to Rome, and he came back with a burning idea. He wanted to build an enormous expiatory temple, a church paid for entirely by ordinary people, brick by brick, donation by donation, as an act of faith for the whole city. No king would fund it, no government would own it. The people would build it themselves, however long it took. Nobody in that room could have guessed those last 4 words, however long it took, would turn into 144 years. On the 19th of March 1882, the very first stone was laid. The original architect was a man named Francisco de Paula del Villar, and his plan was frankly ordinary, a standard neo-Gothic church. Pointed arches, the usual towers, the kind of building you could find in a dozen European cities. If del Villar had stayed in charge, the Sagrada Familia would almost certainly have been finished decades ago, and almost nobody outside Barcelona would have ever heard of it. But del Villar argued with the project's advisors over costs and materials, and within a year he quit. And that single resignation, that ordinary office disagreement, opened the door for one of the strangest, most obsessive minds in the history of architecture to walk through it. His name was Antoni Gaudí. He was 31 years old, and the moment he took the pencil, the plan stopped being a church and started becoming something the world had never seen before. The man who designed a forest of stone. Gaudí did not think like other architects. Where they saw straight lines, he saw the branches of trees. Where they drew flat ceilings, he imagined the inside of a forest canopy. He believed that the straight line belonged to man, but the curve belonged to God. And he set out to build a church that looked less like it had been constructed and more like it had grown out of the earth. Columns that split like trunks, towers shaped like melting honeycomb, stone carved to look like turtles, lizards, snails, and tumbling angels. He threw out del Villar's safe little design and replaced it with a cathedral of 18 soaring towers, each one a symbol: 12 for the apostles, 4 for the evangelists who wrote the Gospels, 1 for the Virgin Mary, and 1 final colossal tower in the very center for Jesus Christ himself. Here is the detail that tells you everything about the man. Gaudi decided the central tower would rise to exactly 172.5 meters and not 1 meter more. Why that precise height? Because it had to stay just below the nearby hill of Montjuic. Gaudi believed that nothing built by human hands should ever stand taller than something made by God. So he measured his masterpiece against a mountain and deliberately made it smaller. That is not engineering. That is devotion poured into concrete. But devotion is slow. By the time Gaudi had been working for years, only a fraction of the building existed. He knew the truth and said it out loud without flinching. When people asked him why he was building so slowly, he gave an answer that should send a chill down your spine. My client is not in a hurry. He meant God. And quietly, privately, he knew he would be long dead before the last stone was ever placed. If a story this patient and this strange is the reason you clicked, do that little thing that tells the algorithm to show it to more people who would never otherwise find it. Because almost nobody is telling it like this. The death that almost killed the dream. As Gaudi grew older, he grew stranger and more devoted. He stopped caring about money, about fame, about how he looked. In his final years, he practically lived inside the unfinished church, dressing in such worn-out clothes that strangers sometimes mistook him for a beggar. Every coin he had went into the building. The Sagrada Família was no longer his project. It had become his entire life. Then came the 7th of June 1926. Gaudi, now 73 years old, left the building site and walked toward a church to pray, as he did every evening. He was crossing a street in Barcelona when a tram struck him down, and here is the cruel twist of fate. Because he was dressed so shabbily, with no identification and empty pockets, the people who found him assumed he was a poor old vagrant, and given only basic care. By the time anyone recognized that this ragged old man was Spain's most celebrated living architect, it was too late. When Gaudi died, only a tiny piece of his vision actually existed. By most estimates, somewhere between 10 and 15% of the whole. One single tower, a crypt, part of one facade. That was all. The dreamer was gone, his masterpiece barely begun, and a terrifying question now hung over the entire project. Without the genius, could anyone possibly finish what he had started? Pause on that for a moment, because most great stories would end right here, in failure. This one was only getting started. Fire, war, and the plans that turned to ash. If losing Gaudi was the first blow, the second was almost fatal. And in the violence, a mob broke into the Sagrada Família workshop, the very heart of the project. What they did there nearly erased the building's future forever. Inside that workshop were Gaudi's secrets. Not just drawings, but something far more important, his plaster models. Gaudi did not design like other architects. He distrusted flat blueprints. Instead, he built intricate three-dimensional plaster models, twisting and shaping them to work out the impossible geometry of his towers and ceilings. Those models were the true instructions for finishing the church, the codebook locked inside the great man's mind, made solid. And in 1936, they were smashed. Drawings were burned. Plaster was shattered into thousands of fragments. The crypt where Gaudi himself was buried was even broken into. Think about what that meant. The architect was dead, and now his instructions were ash and rubble. By every logical measure, the Sagrada Familia should have died right there in the fire, an abandoned ruin, a beautiful failure left to rot above the rooftops of Barcelona. But the people who believed in Gaudi refused to let it go. For years, devoted craftsmen got down on their hands and knees and did something almost unbelievable. They sifted through the wreckage and began gluing the shattered plaster models back together, fragment by fragment, like assembling a jigsaw puzzle with most of the pieces missing. From those broken, reconstructed models, they slowly recovered the lost shape of Gaudi's dream. If you are the kind of person who finds that kind of stubborn, decades-long loyalty incredible, drop a single word in the comments, Gaudi, just so I know how many of you are still with me, because this is where the story turns. The decades everyone said it would never end. For most of the 20th century, the Sagrada Familia was the building the world quietly laughed at. Progress was agonizingly slow. Money trickled in from donations, never enough. A tower here, a section of wall there. Decades would pass, and to the casual eye, almost nothing seemed to change. Locals grew up with the scaffolding as a permanent part of their city, so normal that they barely noticed it. Around the world, it became a kind of joke, the punchline to every story about projects that drag on forever. People genuinely believed it would never, ever be finished, that an eternal building site was somehow more poetic than a completed church. And there was a deeper problem. Even with the rebuilt models, finishing Gaudi's design was a nightmare of mathematics. His shapes were based on warped, twisting geometric forms that were brutally difficult to calculate and almost impossible to carve by hand at the scale he wanted. Master stonemasons could spend weeks shaping a single block. Honest engineers estimated the church might take another 200 or 300 years. Some whispered it might never be structurally finished at all. But two quiet revolutions were coming that would change everything. And neither of them had anything to do with faith. One was a flood of money from an unexpected source. The other was a piece of technology Gaudi could never have dreamed of. Together, they were about to do what 100 years of devotion alone could not. The tourists and the machines that cracked the code. The first revolution was tourism. As the decades passed, the half-built Sagrada Familia became one of the most visited places on the entire planet. Millions of people traveled to Barcelona every single year just to stand inside this unfinished forest of stone and stare upward, mouths open, at light pouring through the colored glass. And here is the genius of Bocabella's original idea finally paying off across a century. Every single one of those visitors bought a ticket. In a recent year, almost 5 million people paid to walk through the doors. That ocean of ticket money, combined with private donations, finally gave the builders something they had never truly had before, a steady, enormous flood of funding. The tourists, without realizing it, became the patrons who would finish what kings and governments never would. The second revolution was technology. Remember those impossible twisting shapes that took stonemasons weeks to carve by hand? Modern computers solved Gaudi's geometry in ways that would have looked like sorcery to the builders of the 1930s. Engineers used computer-aided design to model every warped surface with perfect precision. Then computer-controlled cutting machines and giant prefabricated stone panels, developed with help from world-class engineering firms, let crews produce in days what once took months. The pace exploded. Suddenly the towers were not creeping, they were climbing. And so the building that the entire world had written off as the construction project that could never end began racing toward a finish line that, for the first time in 140 years, people could actually see. If you have made it this far and you are still gripped, you already know what to do. Hit that subscribe button now. Because the final chapter of this story is the part almost nobody saw coming, and you do not want to miss how it ends. The final tower in the race against the centenary. As the new century rolled on, the towers rose one after another. In 2010, in a moment of staggering significance, Pope Benedict XVI traveled to Barcelona and consecrated the basilica, declaring this still unfinished building a true and sacred church, 128 years after the first stone. The Apostle Towers went up. The towers of the evangelists rose, each crowned with the symbol of its gospel writer. The great tower of the Virgin Mary was completed and topped with a shining star that now glows over Barcelona at night. Only one tower remained, the biggest of them all, the central tower of Jesus Christ, the colossal spire Gaudi, designed to stand 172.5 meters above the city. And the builders set themselves an almost poetic deadline, a target loaded with meaning. They would aim to complete the great tower in 2026, the 100th anniversary of the day Antoni Gaudí died beneath that tram. 1 century, exactly, between the death of the dreamer and the completion of his dream. Then, somewhere along the way, the building quietly crossed a line almost no one was watching for. As the central tower climbed past the height of every rival, the Sagrada Familia overtook a cathedral in Germany that had held the record for more than a century and became officially the tallest church on the face of the earth. The building the world had mocked as the one that would never be finished was now the tallest of its kind anywhere, and it still was not done. The cross that touched the sky. The final act came in the winter of 2026. To crown the Tower of Jesus Christ, the builders had to lift and assemble an enormous cross, 17 meters tall, as high as a 5-story building, with 4 arms spreading out against the sky, clad in white glazed ceramic and glass so that it would catch and scatter the sunlight. It was raised not in one piece but in carefully combined sections, the lower arm, the central core, the 4 side arms, and finally, the upper arm at the very top. After 144 years, the exterior of Antoni Gaudí's central tower, the highest point of the entire basilica, was complete. The cranes that had defined Barcelona's skyline for generations had finally lifted the last great piece. High inside that cross, at its very peak, sits a sculpted lamb, the Agnus Dei, placed exactly where Gaudí imagined it more than a century ago, so that the symbol at the heart of his church could be seen from within the cross itself. The great ceremony to mark the completion was set for the 10th of June 2026, landing squarely in the centenary year of Gaudí's death, in a city that planned an entire calendar of celebration to honor the architect, who never lived to see a single one of these final towers. The dreamer was 100 years gone. His dream at last scraped the sky. The story isn't quite over, and neither is the wonder so is it truly finished. Here is the honest, fascinating truth, and it is exactly the kind of detail this story deserves. The structure, the towers, the great central spire, the silhouette Gaudí designed, that is at last essentially complete. But the Sagrada Familia is not entirely done even now. Interior work continues, and one grand element remains unfinished and even controversial: the monumental glory facade and its great stairway, work that is expected to continue for years yet, with some decorative pieces not projected to be finished until well into the 2030s. A building that began in 1882 may not lay its final ornament until 150 years after its first stone. But step back and look at what was actually achieved here. A church funded not by emperors or governments, but by ordinary people and the tickets of curious travelers. A masterpiece whose architect was killed by a tram and mistaken for a beggar. A design nearly erased by fire and war, then literally glued back together from shattered fragments. A geometry so impossible it needed 21st century computers to finally crack the code of a 19th century mind. And a finish line that arrived as if scripted by fate exactly 100 years after the dreamer drew his last breath. There may never be another construction story like it in human history. So here is my final ask, and then I will let you go. If this story moved you even a little, if you felt the patience, the loss, the fire, and the triumph of it, then do the one thing that keeps stories like this alive. Subscribe to the channel right now so the next deep dive lands right in front of you. Give this video a like so more people get pulled into Gaudi's incredible story, and share it with one person who has always wanted to see the Sagrada Familia with their own eyes. Tell me in the comments, do you think Gaudi, looking down on Barcelona, would finally be satisfied? Or would he still say his client is not in a hurry? Because some dreams take a lifetime. And the greatest ones, it turns out, take 144 years.